And I'm going to focus in on this area here where the blue flashing line is. So here we have the Arabian plate meeting with the African plate. And so we have plate separation going on. So the plates are separating, and that's what's formed that water body in between the two plates. Essentially is the Red Sea, which is a gap being formed as two plates separate from each other. That plate separation is crucial for understanding these next landform features, the Afar Triangle and the Great Rift Valley, which are both, for the most part, in East Africa. Of course, the Great Rift Valley kind of borders East Africa and Central Africa. Here we have the Afar Triangle, and I zoomed in on it, and you can actually, as I fade in the triangle, you can actually somewhat see this landform feature from the satellite imagery. But what we have here is, we've mentioned before, in the Arabian plate is separating from the African plate. But actually, the Arabian plate, in this particular part of the world, the Arabian plate is separating from the African plate, which is within it separating into two different plates. And so essentially we have the African plate separating into two parts. At the same time, the Arabian plate is separating from both African areas. And so we can kind of visualize this. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to fade in this red. And so the red is just essentially the shapes. And if you look at the shapes, we can actually see how these puzzle pieces fit together. And so if I take that right angle, which is the Arabian Peninsula, so there on the top right, I can kind of fit that into the other right angle, the other red two lines. I can kind of fit that corner in. And so essentially we can see how the plates are separating over time. And so the Arabian plate is separating from the African plates in this particular Afar triangle. And so we're going to have continued plate separation, so it's only going to get farther and farther away. So the Arabian Peninsula and the African continent are just slowly drifting apart. So now we zoom out a little farther, and we look a little bit to the south of the Afar Triangle, and we see the Great Rift Valley. And so these yellow lines here that are flashing are essentially the valley, the Great Rift Valley. And so what's happening here is we see the yellow line is where we see separation occurring. And so we've mentioned beforehand, the Arabian plate is separating from the African plate. But even further, the African plate is separating within it into two individual plates. And so we have the Nubian plate and the Somalian plate. So the Afar Triangle is the specific point where three plates are separating from each other. But if we continue on, this plate separation is occurring actually farther down into the continent of Africa, in which we have two different plates separating from each other, which we can see the separation on land. So here's a colleague of mine took this photo. The photo just essentially shows very fresh separation, very fresh divergence, as slowly but surely Africa breaks up into two separate plates. I like to make a lot of complex animations to further explain things, but to kind of visualize this triple plate separation. Maybe my previous illustrations didn't show it. Hopefully this will, as we go through and show plates separating from each other, and thus the gap getting bigger over time. Now, what we have very close to this plate separation is we have, of course, water bodies. We have the Red Sea, and then nearby the Indian Ocean. And so you can expect, as we get more separation, that the Indian Ocean will actually come in to fill in the cracks as these plates separate from each other. I know I'm getting a bit redundant here, but just visualizing divergent plates. And in the case of this particular area of the world, we have a lot of rain. And so when you have these gaps that are formed, and then you get a lot of rain, what's going to come in to fill those gaps? Lakes. And so in this particular area of the world, we have Africa's Great Lakes. And so some of Africa's biggest lakes, lakes like I said beforehand, they have a lot of settlement nearby. Here we have lakes that provide resources in terms of transportation, but also food sources. So Africa's Great Lakes are essentially formed from these plate separation, divergent plate boundaries, combined with a good amount of rainfall. And so essentially what comes in to fill the void and creates these lakes is essentially precipitation, which we can see here in this kind of this cool satellite image of these very narrow, very thin lakes that have formed along this plate boundary of separation.